This is Forward Boldly. I'm Christine Niles. Hello, welcome to Forward Boldly. I'm your host, Christine Niles, and this is the show where we explore the riches of our Catholic faith and how it informs our daily lives. Today, we have with us a very special guest, Catherine Quinn. She's got quite a story to tell about her background and her conversion to the Catholic faith and how she used to be a bit of a man-hating feminist. So, I should tell you that even though I did not endure some of the abuse that you did in your childhood, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, I was definitely, in one period of my life, very much a feminist, very sympathetic to feminism, very deeply distrustful of men, deeply suspicious of men. The writings of certain feminists resonated with me, and so I can relate to that aspect of your past. First of all, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? I assume you did not come from a Catholic family?
I was never baptized because, my mother was an atheist. My father was brought up Catholic but strayed and decided that I should be able to choose for myself. So even though my grandparents were Catholic, I was never exposed to it whatsoever.
Okay, but there was that bit of a background there. So you actually did not get baptized until just a few years ago, is that right?
Yes.
Now there's an article you've written on Aletheia, and it goes a little bit into the background of your life. You were taken from your home at around age 9 because of abuse.
Yes. It was verbal, mental, really extreme physical abuse. Just things that should never happen to children. 2x4s with nails in them, or couldn't talk to anyone. It was just continual. Drugs, alcohol, I saw them regularly. It is just not a good environment. As a child, you think that thing is normal when it's all you ever see.
Right.
You don't realize how out of the norm that is until you're an adult later on your own.
Sure. And did somebody in the family report you and then CPS took you away?
We never had a stable place to be. We were just constantly moving and moving and moving. And at one point, he moved us in with a friend of his. And he was abusing us one night. And the friend told me to go speak to my school principal the following day. I didn't realize what the ramifications of that were. And I went to my school principal like she told me to do and spoke to him. And then we went to the foster home. And I was in the same foster home because they were trying not to split me and my brother apart. So at that point, the court subpoenaed my mother to come and get us. And that's actually how I met my mother. I had never seen her before. I'd never heard from her before, no letters. So the first day I ever spoke to her was the day she came to pick us up.
Wow. Now, was the environment a little bit better at your mother's house?
There was no physical abuse. There was a lot of mental and verbal abuse. I think that she wanted to be able to love, but she was just so broken down that she didn't know how.
Right. And you said it was during this time that you met a group of Christians?
Yes. I went to a neighborhood park, and there was a homeless man that would go to the park, and I would bring him, oranges and food and things from home. And there was a group of kids there, and they invited me to their church. And I had never been to church before, so the first person that talked to me about Christ.
And so what were your thoughts when you first encountered, the witness of Christians? What did you think?
I was kind of shocked, really. You go through life with no sense of there being anything out there. And I didn't know my mother was an atheist at the time because this sort of thing was never discussed. So I was actually relieved by what they had to say. And the church that I went to was the one place I had that was actually kind and supportive and nurturing at all. And the idea that I could pray and that there was a God who cared about me. When I came home and started talking about God, my mother didn't take to that too well at all. And it was made very clear that God didn't exist, that Jesus was made up, that I should be quiet. Going to church got me ridiculed, but I didn't care about the ridicule because I was so happy when I was there. But she just couldn't adapt very well to being a parent and decided that she didn't want to do it anymore, and so she sent me back to my dad's. And I had no warning it was happening. They basically came in my room one night and said, "You're flying out to live with your dad first thing in the morning." So there was no time to say goodbye, no time to talk to my friends, nothing. I literally came home one night and the next morning I was on a plane.
Wow. This was sort of the time when you you ran away first, right? And then you fell in with the wrong crowd.
Yes, I was at my father's place. And the abuse escalated and it turned sexual, and I was so angry. It was when I first experienced the disconnect, because I couldn't understand why God would allow something like that and not help me. So one day I waited for them all to go to work, because I knew if I ran away and got sent back, I was in for it. And I just picked up the yellow pages and I just called a lawyer's office and asked, what is the legal age I can leave my home? And they said 17. And I said, so if I leave, they can't force me to go back. And he said, no. I hung up and then I took off.
And where did you end up going?
I moved in with some friends of mine and I stayed with them. Now, I didn't know what paganism was. I had never heard of it up until I moved in. And that's when I first became exposed to paganism and feminist ideology.
Right, and it was during this time that you mentioned that you were exposed to feminist ideology and you were reading people like Gloria Steinem, Simone de Beauvoir, and of course Gloria Steinem is just an icon of radical feminism. There's a picture of her out there standing there smiling, wearing a T-shirt that says, "I had an abortion," as if it was something she's proud of. You know, and then, of course, Simone de Beauvoir was essentially the concubine of Jean-Paul Sartre. And she's the author of The Second Sex, sort of a manifesto for radical feminism. But, you know, these women, they tried to exude this image of strength and happiness when you just know deep down inside these women are miserable. They're just miserable. Yeah, and so you wrote here in your article, women did not support one another, but routinely and regularly obliterated one another, all the while subscribing to matriarchal rule.
Yes. On the one hand, I was relieved to have friends. On the other hand, I was really angry at God. And, you know, I started to rebel, and I fell into the wrong place at the wrong time. Right. Now, I started reading these books, and the dangerous thing about those ideals is it causes you to completely lose your belief. The most dangerous thing about it is it completely obliterates your belief in God. You know, it was made clear that Christ was a stolen faith that was stolen from pagans that wanted to suppress and silence women. Now, I didn't know what an abortion even was. I was just routinely told that pro-choice, and I had no idea what an abortion actually was. I remember reading these books, and they had all of these pro-women ideals, but there were certain elements that always felt very uncomfortable to me. The views on traditional women and women that choose to stay and actually parent their children were extremely frowned upon. But I kept reading, and the more I read and the more I was exposed to, the less faith I had. And finally, at one point, after years of it, I no longer believed that Christ existed. I really believed that this was a stolen religion. And of course, I was looking for the origins of faith and where everything came from. And I mistakenly thought I had found it.
Feminists tend to tear other women down if they don't conform to, the feminist ideal, if they don't have the lifestyles that they agree with. And abortion, for places like China and India, little girls are overwhelmingly targeted for sex-selective abortions, and yet, you don't hear a peep from feminists who claim to be supposedly pro-girl and pro-woman. Alice Walker, she's the author of The Color Purple. She's
yes,
well-known
I
feminist.
read a lot of her.
Right, and Alice Walker is a bit of a feminist icon herself, and her daughter wrote a pretty moving article talking about what life was like living with her mother. And she said basically it was hell. She said, her mother never wanted her. She treated her like she didn't have any time for her. And when her daughter grew up, she decided to choose a lifestyle that was totally different from her mother. She wanted to have children. She wanted to get married. And her mother basically disowned her. And they're not on speaking terms anymore. So, all this talk about feminists being pro-woman and pro-girl, well, that's only the case if you agree essentially with their mindset.
That is true. There's this whole hierarchy where women are in charge, and the deity was actually a woman and was supposed to be supportive of women. But everyone I saw that followed these ideals, it was never in practice. It was the complete opposite. I mean, they would verbally abuse each other. They would engage in these social cliques and attack and tear other women down, women that chose traditional lifestyles. And anytime women that I saw branched out and did something different, they were immediately subjected to the same behavior. And I never saw a single instance where women were actually truthfully upheld and supported.
Have you read Dr. Alice von Hildebrand? She's written a book called The Privilege of Being a Woman. Okay, that's the title of it. And it is incredible. And she speaks about feminism and about the church and about Mary and about the roles of men and women and authentic femininity in ways that are just absolutely mind-blowing. I've read that book over and over and over again. She's incredible. But again, it's The Privilege of Being a Woman. Solid Catholic.
Okay, I am going to look that up.
Yeah. Now, you said that at age 34, you read the writings of Margaret Sanger, and they made you ill. Would you say that this was a turning point for you, reading her writings?
Well, I started to feel a little disenfranchised by the years of basically watching women butcher each other. And of course, contraception, which I also never really agreed with, was the order of the day. And one of my friends handed me a book on Margaret Sanger and basically birth control. And I started reading this book, and there were a lot of things like housewives are weeds and they're leeches, and, traditional women need to be railed in. And, of course, all these same things were repeated in Sanger's writings. But the level of just racism and just hatred of people and eugenics ideals, which I absolutely find the entire concept of eugenics revolting. I could not understand that, because men and women, marriage is the cornerstone of every single thing. You don't have a society without it. And you certainly can't have a society when you are killing and weeding out your future citizens.
And as I'm sure you know, Planned Parenthood has a Maggie Sanger Award that they give to women that they consider impressive. And it used to be the case that whenever people would bring up these very disturbing excerpts from Margaret Sanger's writings, Planned Parenthood would write it off as saying, oh, well, you're just taking her out of context, that's not what she means, etc. And at this point, they can't deny it anymore. They no longer take that tack. Now, they just try to avoid the subject altogether because they know that she was indeed talking about eugenics. They know that. And so instead of dealing with it, they just pretty much avoid it.
that entire organization is founded on eugenics.
Totally.
What is curtailing the freedoms of society is that entire practice.
Right.
You're obliterating future citizens. It is like the epitome of voter suppression. You're basically corralling in an acceptable body of people who will vote and speak and think the way that you want them to think. And the fact that they would bring out these pendants that were coat hangers and basically just throw out there what they're doing and just basically say, this is what we're doing and we're proud of it and we don't care and here's your coat hanger necklace. That is disgusting to me.
Absolutely. Now, you also work as a sidewalk counselor, right?
Yes. The reason I actually became interested, now, this past August, we lost our firstborn son to stillbirth. It's kind of like being blindsided because, it's my first pregnancy and you're new to it all. And I discovered we had him autopsied and I discovered that I have factor V Leiden. I didn't know what that was until, of course, I got the autopsy results. Now, of course, me having factor V Leiden, I would have been a eugenicist's dream to get rid of. But after I lost him, of course, I started asking my mother questions about her pregnancy histories. And when I was asking her about this, I discovered that she had had an abortion. After my brother and I came along, I guess they were financially struggling, and my dad pushed her into having the abortion. And, of course, I think that explains a lot of her behavior. After her abortion, she fell into drugs. On top of the abuse, she got this job, and her coworker introduced her to crack cocaine, which then evolved into crystal meth, and she became a completely different person. I mean, she got a criminal record. She started doing things that she would never have done on her worst day. She stabbed my brother through the hands with a pair of scissors and had no remorse while high. And, the fact that she had undergone this, she never had any support. She had no one to talk to. No one empathized, at all. It was just a lot of finger pointing. And after my son's death and I found out these things about her, I started learning what abortion, I knew what it was, but I didn't have a concrete understanding of what exactly it entailed. And then, I learned firsthand what the effects of this actually were while supporting her. So that was actually how she and I started to reconnect. I'm not happy about my son's death, but because of that loss, I know exactly where my son is, and he was buried a Catholic, and I know that he has family up there. And because of him, I was able to find out that I had this gene, which can be life-threatening.
Now, you had also mentioned in your article that you had a deep distrust of men. That's no wonder considering your past and the home that you grew up in. And you also mentioned that Henry VIII played something of a role in your conversion. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I have a massive love of history. I was convinced that Henry VIII was maligned because no matter what he had done, obviously he had family that loved him, and he had some sort of a support base, and people were actually grieved at his death. And I thought, well, a guy that was supposed to be a tyrant, there had to be something there, or, none of these people would have been saddened at his passing. So I started studying Henry. That branched off into learning about the Reformation, which is when I actually learned what a Protestant was. I still had no clue what Catholics were, except for, what I had been told. They were the enemy. They were the ultimate thieves of faith. They stole from pagans and were massively oppressive to women, et cetera, et cetera. During my studies, well, what initially started out as a study to prove that Henry VIII was maligned led into learning about the Reformation. And my favorite one of his wives was Catherine of Aragon. You know, I just had an enormous amount of respect for her. But then when I read that she was Catholic, I cringed because I thought, how could this woman tolerate this? Which was initially why I started looking at her. And then I read that she was a Catholic. But I had an enormous amount of respect for her fortitude and the fact that she did not turn away from the things that she believed in. And I thought, well, if she's going to tolerate this, why would she be so completely loyal to a church that is oppressive to women? I could not understand this. So I started looking at the Catholic Church, trying to understand her, their stances on social justice issues, and the things that I had always been uncomfortable with during my time as a feminist. Their beliefs were completely aligned with my own. And the more of their views of, life, and the sanctity of life and the sanctity of marriage, and the family is the complete backbone of the entire planet. People just basically listing beliefs that are just completely in line with your own, which is completely baffling to me at the time. I hadn't yet progressed on to learning about saints and, the popes and bishops and things like that at that point. What initially attracted me was their belief in social justice and that human beings were valuable and that marriages mattered.
Catherine of Aragon was a truly remarkable woman. I mean, just saintly. And she endured so much for the sake of marriage because she knew, as a devout Catholic, that she was his true wife. Anne Boleyn was a mistress. She was not his true wife, no matter what he might have said or the fact that they, had a second marriage. She knew it was invalid, and she suffered heroically for that. So she's an incredible woman.
And during the time that I was learning this, it never occurred to me that a divorce was wrong. It was so commonplace that it never occurred to me. Reading that, I got not just an education on social justice, on life, and the value of marriage, but I really got an education on, divorce and adultery. And, intellectually, it was amazing to me, too, because when you're just exposed in a society where all this stuff is normal and not questioned and it's okay, and then there's, you look at that and you think, how can that not make sense? I mean, it makes perfect sense, but and there are things that are common sense, but they, when you're not in that world, it never occurs to you.
It's interesting that you should mention that issues like abortion and marriage were things that actually drew you to the church, because those were, I think, two of the very big issues that attracted me to the Catholic Church. I left the church when I was 17 to become kind of an anti-Catholic evangelical. And 11 years later, in my third year at Notre Dame Law School, I came back to the church. And I remember I was extremely impressed by the fact that the Catholic Church alone, out of all, denominations, faith communities, the Catholic Church alone stood as a bulwark with regard to these two teachings, abortion and marriage and divorce, that, they had never changed these teachings in 2,000 years, when other faith communities were sort of caving in to changing mores and shifting, cultures and that sort of thing, changing times. The Catholic Church alone held the ground on these two topics. And I remember thinking to myself, this is what truth looks like. This is what truth should look like. It doesn't change with the shifting mores and cultures and societies and times and popularity. It stays the same always. No matter how popular or unpopular you are, it stays the same. And I remember being very struck by that. with regard to the Catholic Church, and it really made me start to rethink my attitude, my understanding of the Church.
Yes, I find it incredibly beautiful that not just that they have existed for 2,000 years or more, but that they, they're solid. They stand in complete solidarity, and they are constantly the same. It's one united body, and it's global. I mean, the idea that I could, go to France tomorrow and walk into a church and attend the same mass as everywhere around the world, and no matter where I go, the beliefs are exactly the same and they do not change. That is the way it should be.
And it's a great consolation too, isn't it? I mean, it's such a wonderful thing to know that, as you said, you could go to France and enter a Catholic church, and it's the same Holy Eucharist as in America or in Japan or in Germany or in Russia or anywhere else. It's a tremendous consolation. So it's a wonderful thing. It's such a great gift to be a Catholic. And another wonderful thing about the Catholic faith, and I believe this with all my heart, is the one antidote to radical feminism is Mary. Mary is the antidote to radical feminism. That's essentially what Blessed John Paul II said.
Yeah, that is the one thing that really solidified my break. The more I studied, the more I admired and respected the church, and the more I wanted to know. And the more I got involved in my studies, the less time I spent with my friends. And I was so enthralled with what I was learning that I didn't even notice. Now, there was a Catholic church at the end of my street, and I had never set foot on the property. The whole time I was doing my studies, I had never gone in there. It was such a relief to find that, it was literally the inside out. What I thought the church was the complete and total opposite. And it was a huge relief that, women were valued and tradition was honored, and women didn't tear each other down. They supported each other. And all the things that I initially thought the church was, when I was exposed to Mary, it broke every single thought that I had ever had about the Catholic Church. The idea that, women as the bearers of life, that is an enormous thing. And the fact that there was an organization here, this whole global body, that respected the Mother of God. Because you always hear you should respect your parents. But when I was a Protestant, there were not really any examples. Mary only came out at Christmas, but she was never really even properly thanked. It was just, here, she gave birth to Christ. But the rest of the year, you couldn't talk about her.
Yeah.
So, here was a church that actually honored her for what she did. And, here was an example of Christ actually honoring his mother. And it was okay for everyone else to honor her too. And she didn't have to stay on a shelf. And as a woman, it was an enormous role model. And so finding that the church actually really honored and respected women.
Absolutely. I think one of the greatest tragedies of Protestantism is their rejection of Mary.
Yes. Yeah, I honestly think the fact that during the Reformation, the church, the Protestants, broke away from the church. But the other major loss is the fact that the very piece of the church that is one of the most life-affirming examples for women.
Yes, absolutely.
And, she was lost. And because of that loss, you can see it everywhere around the world, the prices being paid.
Yeah, absolutely. Mary is the pinnacle of all creation. She's the pinnacle of
Yes.
all creation. She's God. It's God's greatest creation, and the church teaches this. Today, women have completely lost any sense of their purpose or dignity. Totally lost it.
Yes.
Just denigrating motherhood and killing our own children in the womb, and it's totally diabolical, and it's exactly what Satan wants. It's exactly what he wants.
Yes.
He's gained such a victory
Yes.
over women, and Mary is the antidote to all of that.
Yes. And, it was also during the time that I was learning about her, the fact that she, at the moment of my baptism, I not only gained my own mother back, but I gained his mother too. And it had never occurred to me prior to going into RCIA that she was our mother. It had never yet occurred to me.
Wonderful. Now, something else that's unique to the Catholic faith is the concept of redemptive suffering. And did that in any way help you to cope with the loss of your son?
There was a couple, and they lost their son when he was 2 years old. And it really kind of, not just having the Eucharist in my room, but the fact that even though that door was closed for me, it's beautiful to me that Christ still left a crack in the door, in the sense that even though my son was gone, I could pray and say everything I ever needed to say, and my son could hear me.
Yeah, isn't that beautiful?
The fact that I could say, hey, to my own son, this is what's happening today, and this is all the stuff I wanted to say, but I never got to. And the fact that, and, in addition to that, here was Christ in my room, and he was fully present. And even though the door was shut, he left a crack in it. And there was this couple in the book that had that same experience. And so, even in, the absolute worst situations, he is still completely merciful.
Yes. In one sense, your son is closer to you now than he would have been before,
Yes.
because you can tell him everything in your heart, and he knows.
Yes. And, I know exactly where my son is.
I remember after when Pope John Paul II was getting sick and dying, and it was kind of emotional for me because I loved him.
Even when I wasn't a Catholic, I really liked John Paul too.
Really? I think a lot of people did. But I remember it was such a great consolation for me after Pope John Paul II died, for me to know that I could, in my heart, speak directly to him, and he would know everything that I was telling him. Like, in the past, I would have to maybe write a letter and wait for it to reach Rome, and then in the, slim chance that he'd read it. But now, after he died, it was a great consolation to me to know that I could pray to him and talk.
It's amazing because, as a Catholic, you have all these, there are access to things that you would never have thought of. When I was a Protestant, had I lost my son, I would have just thought that's it. And in a way, you learn to look at pain differently too, because when you're in the world and you're going through pain, you don't think of it as useful. It's just there and you want to get rid of it, and you don't actually really learn.
Right, exactly.
But as a Catholic, you can actually learn through pain, but you can actually do something with your pain. When I look at the life I led, it provides so much fuel for purgatory, it's not even funny.
Right.
And prior to being a Catholic, that would never have occurred to me. I would have just kept running around trying to shut it off,
Right.
Whatever self-destructive avenue happened to be there. Yeah. But as a Catholic, you have, you just get this whole different perspective of pain. And pain may not feel good, but it's something you can make friends with. You can become friends with your pain. And then, when you go through something, a series of horrible things, it's basically like building up this keg of gunpowder to apply towards purgatory.
That was one of the most mind-blowing aspects for me when I returned to the church, was this idea of redemptive suffering, and the fact that there is a purpose to our suffering, and that if we unite our sufferings to our Lord, we can actually help to save souls. I was like, wow,
Yeah,
I can actually help save souls. You know, like what you said,
yeah, and
reducing sufferings in purgatory through my
yeah,
sufferings.
and I wouldn't. You would never find that outside the church.
No, it's not in
You know, you mean
Protestantism.
outside the church, you're just trying to medicate it away or
Exactly.
ignore it or pretend it's not there.
Right.
And, you know, and you have all of these life experiences. Maybe they're not fair, but you learn something from them because, I mean, you know, it gives you a certain stamina that you can deal with things that maybe you otherwise couldn't deal with. And I mean, in the world culture that we're currently living in, I cannot even tell you. Actually, you know, you don't have to just sit there and stuff it all down because it's not going away. It's still there. So, you know, you might as well make friends with it and put it to some use. I mean, the fact that you can actually apply that towards helping other people,
Yes.
I mean, it's all of those experiences, they're not lost
No,
experiences because
exactly.
it fortifies you to live in this current society.
It's
And that's one additional thing in the church that is just amazing.
Yes, it really is, and that's another one of the terrible losses in Protestantism is because they don't believe in redemptive suffering. They actually think it's kind of blasphemous because they think you're somehow taking away from Christ's redeeming work.
Right,
Of course, you're not doing that. And you know,
right,
Christ, he could save everybody with a snap of his finger if he wanted to. He has the power to do that. But he made things in such a way that he desires our cooperation, he desires our help. That's just how he's done it. He has made each of us
right.
co-redeemers with Christ.
I mean, that's a huge honor, you
A
know.
great honor
I
that he's
mean,
given us.
honestly, because, you know, you're really lost to all of that when you're a Protestant. Um, I mean, if you honestly just sat, I mean, just and honestly looked at just the amount of honor he pays to human beings, and it just, I don't think it occurs to most people.
You know, we have no concept of our dignity in Christ. None. It's why we treat each other the way that we do. It's why we settle for less. It's why we choose sin over what God wants to give us. We just have no clue as to the tremendous dignity that we have in Christ. And I
Yeah,
think that's
and
what
here
we need
I
to do.
was, prior to being a Catholic, thinking like, oh, you know, women's rights, women's dignity, how dare they oppress everyone, you know, and you don't even stop and, you know, later when you become a Catholic, you realize just the foolishness of that.
Yeah, yeah. It's a very worldly sense of human dignity and based on what women can do, what we can achieve in this world. And now you attended your first mass in 2011 and you started receiving some instruction
Yeah.
and then you were baptized in April of 2012. And I understand that was a pretty
Yeah.
emotional experience for you.
Yes, because all that time, you know, I had been studying in my home, and here's the Catholic Church right at the end of the street, and I had never gone in there. Um, During the time I started to study Mary, I didn't know about the enormity of Easter Mass. And it was Easter, and I happened to just go in there to sit in on a Mass and find out what it was. And it was completely fascinating. You know, you're learning what the Mass is and what these things represent. And of course, this same thing is going on all over the world. And you know, it's this massive unbroken line. And I sat there watching this Mass, and, you know, that was it for me. I didn't recognize quite the enormity of, you know, the Easter Mass. But I happened to go in there. My first Mass was on Easter. And, you know, I just sat there and I was just completely fascinated. There was a building in the back behind the actual church, and I wandered in there and I ran into a woman, and she asked if she could help me, and I said, yes, I need an education. And she said, okay. And I explained that I had been studying on my own for about roughly a year and a half, and I lived just right down the street. And so, you know, she says, well, I'm the, you know, director of religious education, and got me signed up for RCIA. I just thought I'm going to come in and get an education. And I mean, I really got an education. I sat through RCIA, and, you know, they were able to cover, you know, everything. Any question I had, no matter what it was, you know, it was answered. There was never a wrong question. It was okay to question. And the more I learned, the more I loved the church. And so I got baptized, and it was the happiest day of my entire life. I cried. I was so happy that I broke down and cried. I cried at my confirmation, and I went into, you know, the idea that immediately following my baptism, I could walk into where his body was and literally sit before his body to say thank you. I could never have gotten that anywhere else. Even when my son died, I was fortunate. I gave birth in a Catholic hospital. And even in the middle of that, Christ was still there. You would never be able to find it anywhere else where they can bring the sacrament to your room. Right. And even in the middle of that, he was still there.
Right. That was one of the most mind-blowing things for me, discovering the Holy Eucharist when I returned to the Catholic Church, because I'd known nothing about that before. And, you know, it boggles my mind when former Catholics say things like, I left the Catholic Church because I felt a better connection with the Protestant Church. You know, I just think there is no way that you could have ever really understood the Holy Eucharist in any sense for you to be able to say something like that. There's just no way that you could ever have understood the sacraments, and especially the Holy Eucharist, for you to be able to say something like that.
Yes. When I became a Catholic, of course, I told my friends, and they were completely aghast that I would do that. My mother, her first thing was, why would you do something like that? My Protestant friends all dumped me. They just stuck around and tried to convince me that I made the wrong choice, that when I wouldn't turn around from that choice, they left. You know, if they could just understand the enormity of social justices and what they represent, and, you know, it's a basic common sense not to pollute your body with these birth controls that cause cancer. How can you possibly administer these? A lot of these things, they rewire the body, they override your hormones, and they cause massive health problems. And so to me, the teachings that are life-affirming, to not pollute the body with contraception and to not kill unborn babies, to help out the poor, and the fact that, Christ was more than generous with us. He gave us his mother, and, here is the Eucharist. If people could see that, they would honestly understand why Catholics do not turn away from their faith. How could you possibly ever want to turn away from that, to accept something that strips all of that from you? Yeah. I just logically can't follow it.
Right, and the only thing that you can conclude in the face of that is that these people never really understood the faith in the first place. So let me ask you something. Has your husband noticed a big change in you ever since your conversion?
Yes, actually, when I first started my studies about Henry VIII, he was basically like, okay, sure. And I started explaining things to him. Now, when we married, he was a non-practicing Lutheran. He was brought up Lutheran. He, here I was like this angry pagan feminist, and, I pretty much distrusted and hated all men. And he was the only person in the house saying Christ is Lord. But he was very adamant that Christ was Lord, and that, Jesus was there and he existed and he was the absolute authority. And at the time, here I was worshiping pagan deities and thinking whatever. So I became fascinated with all of this. He wasn't saying anything. He was just kind of like, okay. When I decided to go to RCIA, when I told him that I had chosen to join the church and would be baptized, he brought me home my first statue of the Madonna and Child and a St. Jude. And he was the one person that actually supported what I was doing.
Wonderful.
So, here when I met him, I was, God is a thief, Christ is, thefted from paganism, and I'm angry and hating men. And I came around and I really fell in love with the church, and I told them what I was doing. And while everyone else either ran away and left or questioned why I would do such a thing, he was actually the one person that supported me. Recently, he decided that he wanted to go into the RCIA classes and join the church too. And, that just really made me cry. My mother will actually acknowledge that God exists now. She will actually pick up a Bible, and that in and of itself, if you knew how staunchly atheist my mother was, is miraculous in and of itself.
Wonderful.
I'm still praying for her, but my husband has decided that he wants to join the church. And
now, are you still in the same area and going to the same church?
Well, we moved because he needed to be closer to his job. So I was baptized at St. Jude's Church in Indianapolis.
Oh.
Which, as soon as we're trying to save up for a second vehicle, my parish priest, he was amazing. And the same one that baptized me also came and blessed my son at his funeral. And I would love to return to that parish because I love them so much. There happens to be another parish nearby called Our Lady of the Greenwood, and it's roughly 3 blocks from our apartment, so I've been going there.
So what would you say to women out there who maybe have similar backgrounds to yours, who are angry, who may have suffered a great deal in their lives? What would your words be to them?
Just not to be, if you're out there and you're questioning, to not be afraid to ask questions. No matter what the political climates are, what the social pressures are, what the media tells you, it is okay to ask questions. It is okay not to blindly follow along and to start looking. And if they could just church is instead of what they think it represents, they would be very surprised.
Absolutely. Well, your story is very inspiring, and I will keep you in my prayers, and I encourage all of my listeners to please pray for Catherine, because you're still kind of a baby Catholic, right? I mean, you
yes.
were brought to the church about 2 years ago.
Yeah, you discover after your baptism, that's when the real work gets started.
Yes. Yeah.
Because, you have to unlearn everything that has been embedded in your mind by the media or political parties or society or your friends. You have to literally unlearn all of that and relearn an entire new culture.
Absolutely.
The moment you're baptized, there is a lot of work to do. I may be Catholic for 2 years now, but I'm still a baby.
Yeah.
It's not just that you're fulfilled on an emotional level. There's the intellectual level involved too. There's social. It covers. There is absolutely something there for everyone, and it's completely comprehensive for completely complex human beings.
Yes, and as you said, it can be very hard work. And for those of us who have had major conversions, and it was kind of like lightning striking us, and everything just changed course in our lives, it can be a really wonderful time. You're full of zeal. Your whole life has changed. That doesn't erase the fact that it involves a lot of hard work. It involves a lot of hard work. And that's the wonderful thing about the sacraments. That's why God gives us the sacraments. We've got confession. We've got the Holy Eucharist, Holy Mass, prayer, the Rosary, all these wonderful graces to help us on our way to become holy. But it's very hard work. We have to put in a lot of effort on our parts. And that's just the way that God made it. I mean, he could cure us in an instant and perfect us right away. But that's not the way that he's chosen to do things. He's, asked that we cooperate as well. And like I said, it can be very difficult work.
It's worth it. I mean, it's worth it. I mean, I'm 2 years in, and I can't fathom when I run into people that say they're bored. I mean, I'm 2 years in, and I'm still breaking through the surface, and I can't understand when anyone says they're bored, because it is the most comprehensive, complete.
It's just so rich.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's completely tailored to every single aspect of human beings, every single one, and you won't find that anywhere else.
People who are bored are probably just not reading or studying. I mean, there's just so many riches with regard to theology and the writings of the saints and history, and
yes. And you constantly stumble on something. And of course, anytime you run into any issue you could ever have, you have Mary and you have Christ and you have 2,000 years of solid, unbending tradition and teaching. And, it's not like a cookie cutter, one size, you can only do it this way. You've got thousands of saints, and they each had a different path, different personality types, different perspectives, and they had the exact same problems that we do.
Exactly. Our Holy Father has spoken about the new evangelization. And, what that means is the old evangelization was going out and preaching the gospel to people who had never heard it before. The new evangelization involves basically reteaching Catholics who have already heard about the faith, but who don't really understand it, who have lost the faith. The new evangelization is going out and teaching them again, sort of reawakening in them a love of, an awareness of the Catholic faith in all its fullness and its riches and its majesty and its glory. And I think your story is very powerful. Your conversion, is a very powerful witness to the grace of God, and I think that you have a role to play in this new evangelization, helping to reawaken in Catholics a love for their faith, an appreciation for God, reawakening in them a love for God himself and the great mercy that he shows towards his people. Now, you have a Facebook page, right? People can find you on Facebook?
Yes, a few months ago, I was actually persuaded to get a Facebook.
Yeah.
So, I got a Facebook, I think, back in January. Uh-huh. So I'm on Facebook. You are welcome to send me friend requests.
Catherine Quinn, Quinn, right?
Yes. Meeting other Catholics and even people that aren't Catholics but that are curious, I am more than open to it.
Right. That's one of the wonderful things about the internet is when you don't have a lot of Catholics in your area, the internet sort of puts you in touch with lots of wonderful Catholics all over the world. So, get in touch with Catherine. It's Catherine with a C, Quinn, Quinn, and the title of her article, which I encourage you to read, is posted on Alatea. The title is I Was a Pagan, Hedonistic, Man-Hating Feminist, but now I'm a Catholic. This is my story. Wonderful little synopsis of what she's talked about tonight. So, Catherine, thanks so much for being here tonight. I really appreciate your talking with me and spending the time. You got just a wonderful conversion story, and I really wish you all the best.
Thank you for having me.
And for all my listeners, please remember to check us out on Facebook and also check us out at forwardboldly.com. That's forwardboldly.com, where we have individual pages of each of the hosts and all of their archived interviews in one place. As always, my friends, keep fighting the good fight of the faith. And in the words of Saint Joan of Arc, in God's name, forward boldly. God bless you, everybody. Good night.